Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome on this occasion of the Speaker's Lecture for 2019. My name is Clarissa Surtees and I'm the Clerk of the House of Representatives. Let me begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which Parliament House rests and to their elders. I would also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons who might be present today. At the outset, I acknowledge the Speaker, the Honourable Tony Smith MP, distinguished guests, Mrs Heather Henderson, former clerks and all guests. The Speaker's lecture will be delivered by Troy Bramston, who will be introduced shortly by the Speaker himself, and Troy will be available to sign copies of his book on Sir Robert Menzies for a short time after the lecture. For those of you not based in Parliament House, I mentioned that your visit is taking place on a sitting day, and you might be able to tell by the energy levels changing in the building, and not to mention the ringing of the bells. Some people find they can feel the tension in the air. One unfortunate consequence of this is that today being a sitting day, the Speaker and I will need to leave a little early before 12 o'clock because the House is due to sit at that time. So our apologies for that at the outset, and a colleague of mine will make some concluding remarks after Troy has finished his lecture. So it's now my privilege to introduce the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honourable Tony Smith MP. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Clarissa, to Troy and his family, distinguished guests, Heather Henderson, my friend and former colleague, Dr David Kemp, and fellow members of Parliament and ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you and to introduce Troy to you to give the second Speaker's Lecture. This lecture was instituted to mark the 30th anniversary of the opening of the building, and the first lecture was given by Paul Kelly. It was instituted with the aim of reflecting on our political history, the lessons we can learn from it, particularly in our current political environment in this Parliament. And many of you will know Troy is one of Australia's foremost political journalists and authors, and since 2011 has been a regular contributor to Sky News. Of course, he writes for The Australian. He's very youthful, but so far he has written or edited 9 books, including Paul Keating, The Big Picture Leader, and together with Paul Kelly, co-authored the award-winning book The Dismissal in the Queen's Name in 2015 that was launched here on the 40th anniversary of the dismissal on Remembrance Day. Troy's latest book, Robert Menzies, The Art of Politics, not only draws on previously unpublished interviews, but in his typical way he's gone the extra mile to reveal some wonderful parliamentary anecdotes and events to provide a profound insight into what drove Menzies, how he developed as a parliamentarian and how he governed. He writes of Menzies' poems about the clerk at the table, and I know this is of particular interest to the clerk and former clerks who are here, and a reply by the clerk at the table. That poem and a reply by the clerk are on display for you here today. In an ever faster moving world, I firmly believe books like this matter more than ever. History matters, the record of our parliamentary democracy matters, but it takes people like Troy, dedicated people, to bring this to life, and he's certainly done that in this book. Would you give him a very warm welcome as he gives the second Speaker's Lecture?
Well, I'm honoured to give this year's Speaker's Lecture, and I thank the Speaker, Tony Smith, for this very privileged opportunity. I acknowledge the Clerk of the House of Representatives, Clarissa Surtees, also ministers, members of Parliament, staff, colleagues and friends that are here. I acknowledge Heather Henderson, who I regard as a national treasure, and Dr David Kemp for being here as well. And I thank my parents, Jeff and Michelle Bramston, and my wife, Nikki Seeby, for also being here. Robert Menzies continues to loom large in Australian political life. He defined and he dominated an era in Australian politics. He's never been matched for his record term in office or his election victories, and he remains the only Prime Minister to leave office at a time of their own choosing in the post-war period. However, debate over Menzies' life and legacy has never settled, which makes him quite a compelling biographical subject. Some see him as the personification of statesmanship in the 20th century. Others see him as snap frozen in time, as a stuffy Edwardian not in tune with the emerging Australia of the 1950s and 60s. Liberal leaders routinely invoke Menzies and enlist him to their cause, and it's not surprising that some Labor leaders have sought to delegitimise Menzies' legacy because it remains so important to the Liberal tradition. The continuing debate over Menzies' place in history, his achievements and his failures, and his enduring legacy underscores this significance. Yet it's been 20 years since a full life biography of Menzies has been published. Sadly, this says a lot about our commitment to telling our own history and our attitude to Prime Ministers. I've spent much of my life reading, researching and writing about political leadership. I've interviewed every Prime Minister since Gough Whitlam. And in this lecture today, I'll discuss writing the life of Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. I'll reflect on his character, his values, his achievements and his failures, and conclude with some thoughts about how our politics might be stronger if we could learn from his example. When Robert Menzies retired in the summer of 1966, he bestrode the political stage like a colossus. He had served as Prime Minister over two separate terms, from 1939 to 1941 and from 1949 to 1966. He was the principal founder of the Liberal Party 75 years ago next month, and he led it to 7 election victories. He presided over a nation imperilled by war and prosperous in peace. He was a politician who was admired and respected at home and abroad, although not universally loved. He had immense authority and stature. Australians viewed him as a safe, trusted and reassuring leader. He even looked prime ministerial. He was over 6 feet tall and he had a bulky 20-stone frame. He had fleshy jowls, short silvery grey hair and piercing blue eyes underneath black bushy eyebrows that could intimidate all on their own. He wore buttoned-up double-breasted suits, usually with a crisp white shirt, a dark tie and a pocket handkerchief. He smoked fat cigars, mixed a lethal martini and liked a Scotch whisky in the evening. He often wore a felt Homburg hat and carried walking sticks, some engraved with RGM. This sartorial elegance augmented his gravitas and his presence. He spoke in a honeyed voice with crisp expressiveness that was British in tone but uniquely Australian in its inflection. He filled any room, was often imposing and always the centre of attention. For generations of Australians, Menzies was the Prime Minister. He governed during a golden age of strong economic growth, low unemployment, increasing wages, rising living standards, a massive influx of migrants and an expanding home-owning middle class. It was a time mostly of prosperity and stability. The Menzies government has a number of signature policy achievements. There was a huge expansion in universities and colleges. Funding was provided to non-government schools, which helped to end the sectarian divide. Canberra was developed into a true national capital. The United States alliance was cemented with the ANZUS Treaty, and new relationships were forged in the Asia Pacific, which Menzies visited more than any other Prime Minister. There were also mistakes and misjudgments that all Prime Ministers make. It's a tragedy that almost 60,000 Australians were sent to the Vietnam War, a conflict that was never properly understood, ended in failure and later divided Australians. His biggest political misstep was attempting to ban the Communist Party, which saw him depart from Liberal principles. And his views on Aboriginal Australians and the White Australia policy are jarring for many today, although totally understandable for a man born in 1894. Menzies was a traditionalist and a sentimentalist, but he was not a reactionary. He was a cautious reformer. Menzies advocated liberalism within a conservative economic and social framework. And while Menzies championed free enterprise, the economy remained shackled to highly regulated product, capital and labour markets. Menzies' longevity was also partly gifted by an opposition plagued with division and saddled with lacklustre leaders in Arthur Calwell and Bert Evatt. Menzies' Australia is not the Australia of today, just as it is not the Australia of Ben Chifley or John Curtin. The aspect of Menzies' legacy that has the most contemporary relevance, I argue, is his mastery of the art of politics and his approach to political leadership. I identify 5 key elements in Menzies' approach to leadership. First, he understood and absorbed the British legal tradition, and he admired Westminster parliamentary democracy. He was skilled at parliamentary procedure, he understood the importance of winning debates in Parliament, and he knew how to use the chamber for dramatic purposes. He was, after all, a born performer. He was an effective chair of cabinet who allowed ministers to have their say and a free rein to work their portfolios, but he could be ruthless with those who he judged to be poor performers. He respected the public service and he expected frank and fearless advice from it and was a good administrator of government. Second, he had purpose, belief and conviction. He knew what he wanted to do, why he wanted to do it, and whom he represented. He was able to work with public servants and ministers and his party to develop policies, communicate them effectively to voters, and to then make sure that they were properly implemented. Menzies also understood, thirdly, the importance of party management. He developed effective relationships with the Liberal Party organisation, he respected the party membership, and he was attentive to the needs of backbenchers. He also understood the importance of managing the coalition with the Country Party. He respected its leaders and their views and made sure that any disagreements were satisfactorily dealt with. Fourth, and while it may be axiomatic for a Prime Minister, Menzies was an astute politician. He was a good strategist and a tactician when it came to the timing of elections, the framing and communication of issues, and exploiting weaknesses in his opponents. He was often cautious, but he knew when to take a principled stand and when to make a pragmatic decision. The mark of any good politician is learning from his or her mistakes, and Menzies was able to consolidate after repeated policy and political setbacks and close election results throughout his political career. And fifth, Menzies understood that much of politics is persuasion and advocacy. Menzies was a superb orator and parliamentary debater and was without peer on the campaign trail. He was a skilled radio broadcaster and he adapted his speaking style successfully to television and used both mediums to enhance his presentation of political arguments and policy issues to voters. Now, Menzies' town hall meetings were legendary. They would be packed with supporters, opponents and the undecided. Some went for entertainment and brought sandwiches, tea and coffee to watch. Menzies' speeches were often punctuated by cheers, boos, applause and laughter. Attendees waved placards that read "Pig Iron Bob" or "Ming the Merciless." Sometimes eggs or tomatoes would be thrown. But Menzies was in his element and rarely fazed. He gained a reputation for his sharp wit, which was not always to his advantage, even if it won him a few laughs. A woman once said to Menzies, "I wouldn't vote for you if you were the Archangel Gabriel." Menzies replied, "If I were the Archangel Gabriel, madam, I'm afraid you would not be in my constituency." A miner once interjected, "Tell us all you know, Bob. It won't take very long." Menzies responded, "I'll tell you everything we both know, and it won't take any longer." A man yelled out at a public meeting, "What you going to do with housing, Bob?" Menzies replied, without missing a beat, "Put a H in front of it." Now, this wicked wit would often be on display in Parliament too. Menzies also took note of how others performed in Parliament. Legend has it that at the commencement of question time, Menzies would often take out a blank piece of paper and draw up a scorecard to rate his ministers. At the end of question time, Menzies would carefully fold and tear the paper into tiny pieces and then, with a raised eyebrow and a slight smile, drop it into the bin so that nobody ever knew what his assessment was. Now, the primary motivation for writing a book about Menzies was discovering a series of interviews that he had given in 1972 and 1973 for a biography that was never completed. In the interviews, Menzies talked about his upbringing, he reflected on political events, policies and personalities, and offered political lessons drawn from his experiences. Menzies thought none of his immediate successors were up to the job of being Prime Minister. He also voted for the Democratic Labor Party in 1972 and possibly, according to some sources, also in 1969 and 1974. He thought the Liberal Party should merge with the Country Party and form a coalition with the DLP. Menzies thought that Liberal salvation would only come in the 1970s with Malcolm Fraser, and he was thrilled when he became leader in 1975. But Heather Henderson told me that her father was soon disappointed with Fraser too. Menzies also revealed that he did not feel secure in his own leadership until at least the 1949 election. "You can't win with Menzies" was a common refrain of the time. Menzies revealed that some in the party wanted to replace him with, can you believe it, Don Bradman or Tom Playford as Liberal Party leader. One of the important revelations in the book is that Menzies was deeply affected by the decision not to enlist in the First World War. His two older brothers, Les and Frank, had enlisted in the war, and Belle, his sister, had eloped with a soldier and was banished from the family. The family was plunged into emotional turmoil. Menzies revealed that his father was so stricken with grief that he nearly died. So it was decided that Robert, then a university student, would remain in Melbourne to look after the family. Menzies was quite unfairly branded as a coward for not enlisting in the war. Menzies said, "I just had to do something to justify my existence. I decided that I ought to go into Parliament." So the First World War was the decisive event that propelled Menzies into state and then federal politics. Menzies himself said this in the unpublished interview, that this was not a reason he went into politics, but the reason he went into politics. And the decision not to enlist continued to have an effect on him. A key reason why Menzies went overseas as Prime Minister during the Second World War and spent months abroad while his colleagues grew restless at home was to show Australians that he did not lack courage. Menzies said he had to prove that he was not yellow and wanted to set an example and not run away from any danger. So he was chasing his demons. Now, Menzies' vast collection of personal papers is housed in 687 boxes at the National Library of Australia. I was granted full access to this treasure trove of material, and I discovered fragments of memoirs, notes, letters, reports, and verse that have not been published before. Sitting in the National Library or the National Archives and surrounded by boxes of files offers a window into history. For me, it's like stepping inside H.G. Wells' time machine and being transported to the past. I was able to view for the first time all of Menzies' correspondence with his sister Belle, and I also discovered a memo that Menzies wrote after the 1943 election. In this memo, he outlined the structure, philosophy and ethos of the party that would become the Liberal Party in 1944. However, Menzies then thought that the new party should be called the Liberal Democratic Party. In Menzies' papers, I also found unpublished notes and memos about the Suez Crisis, how he was awarded a knighthood, and the appointment of Garfield Barwick to the High Court. But documents can only tell you so much. So with my wife Nikki and our children Madison and Angus, we visited Jeparit in January this year. Now, visiting a small country town some 350 kilometres from Melbourne is what I regard as a great family holiday. And Jeparit gave us a unique insight into Menzies. It really is extraordinary that a boy born in the back of the family's general store in 1894 could become Prime Minister, the last Prime Minister born in the 19th century. It is often forgotten that Menzies was not part of the political establishment. The Menzies family was not particularly wealthy, and young Robert went to school in Ballarat and Melbourne and to university by winning scholarships. In Jeparit, we visited the site of the family store and the Mechanics Institute where Menzies read books as a young boy. We walked up and down the main Roy and Charles streets and we saw the spire that Menzies unveiled in his own honour in 1966. We visited the local school where a phrenologist had run his hand over Menzies' boyhood skull and when it lifted off, proclaimed that one day this boy would become a barrister and a public speaker. It was also important to talk to those who knew Menzies. So I conducted several interviews with Heather Henderson, who gave me a fascinating insight into her family and into her father. There are only two ministers surviving from the Menzies government, Doug Anthony and Ian Sinclair, two grand old men of Australian politics. Anthony, who had actually first met Menzies as a boy, told me that the Prime Minister was consultative in Cabinet but could be brutal with ministers who were not across their brief. Sinclair recalled that Dame Paddy Menzies took a very close interest in the development of Canberra. She would not hesitate to complain to her husband about the garbage not being collected, the power going off, or the footpaths not being up to scratch. This would, of course, be the number one item on the Cabinet agenda the next day. Jim Forbes was the last surviving Liberal minister from the Menzies government, and he died last month. The afternoon that I spent with him in Adelaide on the eve of his 95th birthday last year is one that I will always treasure. Forbes remembered that Menzies' support to ministers in difficulty, like when he was introducing national service, was absolute. Menzies would stick with you no matter what, Forbes said. I also was lucky to conduct the last interview with Sir John Carrick, a true gentleman of politics, who gave me a unique perspective on Menzies and the Liberal Party in its formative years. Carrick said that in the 1940s, Menzies had real enemies and there were substantial doubts about his capacity to lead the party. Memories of Menzies' time in state politics and his first Prime Ministership, which ended in resignation, were never far from mind before the party's great 1949 election triumph. The earlier Menzies had poor relations with many colleagues. When Menzies was told by an MP that he did not suffer fools gladly, Menzies replied, "What do you think I'm doing now?" I also learned a lot by interviewing public servants Lennox Hewitt and Richard Walcott, who had both worked with Menzies. Hewitt, who's now 102, also knew Menzies' father when they worked together at BHP. And his staff, William Heseltine and Tony Eggleton, took me inside the Prime Minister's office. Heseltine thought Menzies was a shy man, but also warm, generous and very kind, unlike the public stereotype. Heseltine also agreed that the Queen, who he had later worked for as her official secretary, was indeed a little bit embarrassed by Menzies' "I did but see her passing by" speech in 1963. Eggleton had terrific anecdotes too. He said that Menzies would stop his prime ministerial car just before it would reach a destination where he was to speak outside. He would then hop out and Eggleton would liberally apply fly spray on his back so that no flies would distract the audience from Menzies' speech. Eggleton organised Menzies' farewell press conference, which was broadcast live on national television to the largest audience ever at that point. But Menzies insisted on having what he called a nervous pee as before he would walk from his office to the parliamentary dining room and then sit down with the press for the last time. Now, I'm often asked what Menzies would make of politics today. Like all of us who think that politics is important, I think Menzies would be disappointed by the significant fall in trust in government over the past 50 years. Menzies believed that politics was an honourable profession and that it ought to attract the best and brightest that the country could offer. He thought politics should be a battle of ideas rather than a clash of personalities or political slogans and advertising campaigns. Remember the campaign in the lead up to the centenary of Federation, which asked what kind of country would forget the name of its first Prime Minister? I gather that most Australians still know more about George Washington than Edmund Barton, even though Barton was as critical in the founding of a nation for a continent and a continent for a nation. I think it's more troubling that just 55% of young Australians support democratic government compared to non-democratic government. It is why I believe we should make civics education a bigger part of our school curriculums. It's essential that we equip young people to be active and engaged citizens with an appreciation of democratic values. It should also be compulsory for students in high school to visit Canberra and come here to Parliament House and see Old Parliament House as well and other institutions such as the National Library, the National Archives and the magnificent Australian War Memorial. Now, I'm a big fan of US presidential libraries. It will come as no surprise to any of you that I've even taken my wife Nikki and our children along to many of them. And while we have some libraries and institutes dedicated to Prime Ministers here, I think we can do much better. Australia should have a US-style presidential library system supported by government and supplemented with private funding that can house the papers of former Prime Ministers, incorporate museums that tell the stories of their lives and the issues that they grappled with, and run seminars and lectures that serve the public interest. Several Australian prime ministerial homes have been preserved, and I welcome Scott Morrison's decision to purchase Bob Hawke's childhood home at Bordertown in South Australia. But to our shame, in recent decades, a number of prime ministerial childhood homes are no longer with us. Paul Keating and Gough Whitlam's have just recently been demolished, and John Howard's family abode is now a Kentucky Fried Chicken. No other country would allow this to happen. Josh Frydenberg recently funded the digitisation of prime ministerial papers. This is a very good initiative, and so is the digitisation of parliamentary papers by the Parliamentary Library. But more funding is needed to help bring archives into the digital age so that students, scholars and citizens can easily access the documents that shaped Australia. I would like to see the government fund the publication of books by academics, scholars and journalists. Can you believe that not every Australian Prime Minister still has a biography written about them? The Parliament should initiate a program of grants, scholarships and fellowships that lead to new books, papers and documentaries, exhibitions, websites, lectures and seminars about politics. One idea worth emulating is the United Kingdom's Researcher in Residence at number 10 Downing Street. This is funded by a partnership between government, academia, business and charities. The most recent researcher, Jack Brown, just published a fascinating book about the history of number 10. Parliament House does a great job in promoting the work of the Senate and the House online throughout this building. We should think, though, about making the Parliamentary Library, which also does terrific work, a public institution like the US Library of Congress that is open to all. Politics also needs to be made a more attractive career alternative. Remuneration is not the only inhibiting factor for some, so is time away from families and friends and being in the public spotlight. More video conferencing and online work, family-friendly hours, collaborative workspaces, and perhaps longer sittings over fewer days and shorter parliamentary debates could be part of the answer. We should also consider allowing people who are not members of Parliament to serve in Cabinet or on Cabinet committees which may require a constitutional change. And perhaps business, community and educational leaders could be made specialist policy envoys or asked to head up policy task forces. We also need a greater effort to attract mid and late career professionals into the public service who can provide a real-world contribution to policy making. I would also like to see government departments appoint independent in-house think tanks that can examine complex issues, engage with citizens and make their views publicly known. 4-year fixed terms for the House of Representatives and an 8-year Senate would also allow governments to focus on the longer term and take some of the politics out of election timing. I welcome the review of question time, which will hopefully lead to a less rigid and orchestrated exchange of ideas and a thorough examination of issues. The idea of an independent speaker, like the House of Commons, has merit, even though the Parliament currently has, of course, an excellent speaker in Tony Smith. I wholeheartedly support the Indigenous voice to Parliament. It has the potential to significantly improve policy making after years of disappointment, neglect and failure. And I wish this Parliament had the bustling hive of activity at its centre, like the old King's Hall down the hill, where politicians, journalists and the public would always meet to talk about politics. A review of the design of Parliament House, some 30 years on, is perhaps also needed. Parliament House can be an isolating place which must impact on the health of those who work here. The spontaneous interactions and the socialising of the past has largely been lost. It may help to explain why politics has become more tribal and more combative. If we did just some of these things, we might be able to go some way towards addressing the declining trust in government, persuading new generations that politics is an honourable profession, repairing our civic dialogue and elevating policy debates, gaining a new appreciation of our political history, and strengthening our democracy by encouraging an active and engaged citizenry. Let me conclude by reflecting briefly on some friendships across the political divide. There are some cross-party friendships in this building, but not many. Perhaps the best known is Josh Frydenberg, who launched my book on Menzies, and Ed Husick, a friend of mine. Our politics is all the better for these friendships, and we should encourage more of them. Robert Menzies enjoyed friendships on the opposite side of politics, most notably with John Cain Sr. in Victoria, and also with John Curtin and Ben Chifley. They still fought politics as hard as anyone does today, but they also respected and admired one another, and they enjoyed each other's company. In 1951, there was a grand Jubilee Ball in Parliament House. Ben Chifley, who was then the opposition leader, decided not to attend. He didn't own a tuxedo and he didn't fancy himself as much of a dancer, so he stayed in his room at the Currajong Hotel. But during the evening, Chifley died of a massive heart attack. The news soon made its way to Parliament House. Robert Menzies, with his eyes moist, went to the stage, interrupted the band and told the partygoers the news and said they should go home as a mark of respect for the country having lost a great Australian. Menzies cried that night in King's Hall and he did not care who saw him. Menzies, Chifley and Curtin were remarkable men, and their friendships tell us much about an era that is largely long gone. If we look to Menzies, just as we might look to Curtin and Chifley, we can learn from their life of public service. Winston Churchill once counselled a young student to study history, because in history lie all the secrets of statecraft. Thank you all for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Stuart Wooley. I'm the Clerk Assistant Committees in the Department of the House of Representatives. We've had a real treat this afternoon, I think, and an opportunity, I think, in particular to reflect on the great service that Mr. Bramston has done to us all by, in particular, unearthing these unbroadcast interviews from the 1970s and sort of really enriching, I think, our understanding of this time in our political history and our familiarity, I guess, with somebody who is such a towering figure in our political history. Mr. Bramston, I think, has agreed to take a few questions from the audience, and I'd sort of invite him to come back to the lectern to take those. There are some cordless mics floating around. Perhaps if you have a question, you might raise your hand and and I'll pass over to Mr. Bramston to answer. Sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Troy, at the very outset, thank you very much for being here today and also for the wonderful historic work that you do. I'm a regular watcher on Sky News, and the way that you're clearly a Labor man, and clearly the way that you speak, it's always wonderful to hear someone who has such respect for the process and for people on both sides of the political line. You play it so straight. It's tremendous to have you here and to hear you speak today, so thank you. I'm interested, there was one particular point where you mentioned there was the lacklustre leadership on the Labor side, particularly at those point during the late 50s and 60s. Is it possible at all for you to estimate a percentage of how likely it was that Sir Robert stayed a Prime Minister for as long as he did because of the split within the Labor Party and the emergence of the DLP and so on, notwithstanding Sir John Killen's victory back in 61?
Yeah, look, thank you for your kind comments. Look, I mean, it was a factor. There's no doubt about that. The Democratic Labor Party did help to leave Labor out of office for such a long period of time. And there was that particularly close 1961 election where the Menzies government got back with just a one-seat majority after allocating a speaker, and there are a number of seats that were decided on Democratic Labor Party preferences. So I don't think we can deny that. That's just a historical fact. And yes, in many ways, you know, Evatt and Caldwell were both huge public figures in their time. They'd both been senior ministers in the Chifley or Curtin governments. They were known internationally. They were big figures on the Australian political stage, but it's hard to imagine them ever becoming Prime Minister today. They really were not suited to the modern television age, which, as I mentioned in my talk, that Menzies did successfully adjust his public presentation to. Although it's worth mentioning not only that 1961 election, but in 1954, the Evatt Labor Party came very close to winning an election and winning government as well. So it's hard to imagine, but I think one of the key lessons I found from Menzies is that even when he had setbacks within a parliamentary term, he could easily recalibrate and consolidate his political position and go on and win another election. And one of the best examples of that is actually the providing of state aid to non-government schools, which had been a Labor idea, but the Labor Party was so divided on it that they couldn't actually get it through. And in fact, the New South Wales Labor government had actually announced that as their policy in a budget speech. And can you believe that the National Executive of the Labor Party ordered the state government to abandon that policy of providing limited state aid to public schools? And so Menzies saw an opportunity here and he jumped on it and he did it. So Menzies was very good as a politician in seizing opportunities when they came up.
Other questions? Well, thank you, Mr. Bramston.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for coming to this speaker's lecture today. I think you'll all agree it's been a tremendously interesting and sort of inspiring presentation for those of us who are interested in Australian political history. So thank you and good afternoon. On behalf of the clerk and the speaker, thanks again to Mr. Bramston and all the best. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder that there's a stall set up at the back for selling copies of Mr. Bramston's book, if you'd like to visit that on the way out.